Welcome to Asian Review. I'm your host, Bill Sharp. My guest today is Dr. Alexander Vuving, Associate Professor at the Asian Pacific Center for Security Studies. Dr. Vuving's specialty is Southeast Asia affairs, also the rise of China, and also soft power. He was born in Vietnam, later studied in Budapest, Hungary, went on and studied in Germany, and then also worked in France for a while before coming to the U.S. Before he was at the APCSS, he was a faculty member at Tulane University. Welcome to Asian Review.
Thank you, Bill.
Well, we're very fortunate to have Dr. Vuving with us today. As we speak, tensions are mounting in the South China Sea, or what some people, that is China, call the South China Sea. Vietnam prefers to call it the East Sea, and the Philippines prefer to call it the West Philippine Sea. Nevertheless, let's just take a look at our map here, and maybe we could get a close-up on this, and it'll orient us to the area. As you can see, Vietnam borders the South China Sea on one side, the Philippines on the other. To the northeast is China. And also to the further south is Brunei, and you can't quite see it on the map, but Malaysia. All countries which have claims for the number of small little islands dotting the South China Sea. And maybe we should take a look at this one as well, and this will help folks get even a little bit more oriented. As you see that sort of that red dotted line, this indicates the Chinese claim to the South China Sea. This is a claim which China reminds us they inherited from the previous government of China, the Republic of China, which essentially went out of business except for its rule in Taiwan in 1949. Quite a large area, and the source of a lot of the mounting tension. Now that we've got everybody oriented, we'll ask our guests to give us a little background on this issue simmering in the South China Sea.
The South China Sea dispute dates back to it's one of the top 10 flashpoints in the world. And among the top 10 flashpoints in the world, the South China Sea dispute is one of the oldest disputes. It's older than the Palestine issue, older than the Kashmir issue. And the South China Sea dispute actually dates back to the 1920s, when China and France, which was at that time represent Vietnam, because France was the colonial master of Vietnam. So France acts on behalf of Vietnam, and China and France contested each other's sovereignty claim on the Paracel and the Spratly Islands in the South China Sea. So that was probably the first time when the South China Sea became a dispute. And the historical background of that dispute between China and France was Japanese expansion, the expansion of Japanese activities in the South China Sea. In 1909, the Japanese, coming from Taiwan, took possession of Pratas Island, I think in this area just off the coast of Hong Kong, in the north of the South China Sea. And that, because of that, China got attention to the South China Sea islands, and laid claims on the South China Sea islands, and there was a dispute between China and France over the sovereignty of those islands. But that was not the first time when China and Vietnam laid claim on the South China Sea islands. In the early 19th century, according to contemporary Western missionary, a Vietnamese king officially took possession of the Paracel and Spratly Islands in 1916. And then, 1816.
And that was Vietnam.
That was Vietnam.
Okay.
And then during the 1880s, there were a couple of German boats tried to survey the waters surrounding the Paracel and the Spratly Islands, and the Chinese government and the Vietnamese government separately protest the Germans to the Germans, but they were protested. They protested separately, and apparently they didn't know of each other's claims. So both China and Vietnam thought that the Paracel and Spratly Islands were in their control for centuries, but they were not aware of each other's claims. It was the pre-modern time, you know,
right.
and communication is not based on internet right now. So that was the kind of the historical beginning of the dispute in the South China Sea. And you see that on the background, it's not the security, not the energy, not the oil and gas and anything, any economic motive on that, but the security motive.
Yeah, you know, that I'm glad you mentioned that, because I just wanted to ask, because today so much of the argument seems to center around, well, there are natural resources there, and all these countries are looking for that. But in those days, it was security and sovereignty.
Right.
Okay.
Sovereignty stemming from security.
Okay.
You know, if they are not valuable, they are not strategically valuable in terms of security, they don't pay attention to them. But because of their strategically importance in terms of security. And for China, you know, there is a famous Chinese doctrine of how to defend the Chinese mainland. And they have the concept of the first island chain and the second island chain. So the Spratly Islands, the Paracel Islands, so basically the South China Sea lies within the first island chain, which from the Chinese perspective is of vital importance to the defense of China.
Right. You know, just a couple of things. You mentioned the Pratas Islands, which on our map is, oh boy, let me see, right up here. And probably should just clarify that that group of islands is under the control of Taiwan.
Yes.
And that really doesn't seem to be, there doesn't seem to be much focus on that. It's really the Spratlys and the Paracels.
Right.
And actually, now correct me if I'm wrong, Vietnam controlled the Paracels up until 1974, when China took advantage of the old weak Republic of Vietnam government, South Vietnam government, and essentially took the islands from them in a brief military encounter. Now, you know, speaking historically, has this area always been a vital sea lane?
It has always been a vital sea lane to both China and Southeast Asia, even before the dawn of, even before the arrival of the Westerners.
Okay.
So, for example, for China, from the beginning of its history, there are just a few roads linking China with the rest of the world. And for the Chinese, there were always an urge and a big push in terms of trading with India, going to India to get you know, the sutras. You know, India was the homeland of Buddhist texts. So all kind of cultural, economic motives for China to find a way to go to India. And one way is through the Silk Road, through Central Asia.
Right.
Another way is through the mountainous area in, you know, Tibet and Burma today. And then there is the sea road between basically South China, through the South China Sea, through the Malacca Strait, and up to India. So it was very important for the Chinese to trade and exchange things, you know, cultural things, economic things with the rest of the world.
Yeah, you know, it's so interesting listening to you talk about this, because, okay, that was back then, but now, and even as far back as, you know, the era of the Silk Road, but still, you know, today these routes are still very important, aren't
even
they?
Even more today, it's
for
even
oil?
more important for one thing that I just mentioned, the defense of mainland China.
Right.
If you look at Chinese history in the 19th century, the Chinese commentators often say that China, collapsed at the hands of Western powers coming from the sea.
Right.
And so the first island chain has a tremendous strategic importance for the defense of mainland China.
Right.
And then economically, 80% of the oil that China imports from outside world runs through the South China Sea.
Right.
And then about three quarters of commodities importing and exporting between China and the Middle East, Europe, and Southeast Asia, South China, run through the South China Sea. So the South China Sea is home to the lifeline of East Asia, not just for China, but also for Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. And so the Chinese thinking in terms of strategic, perspective.
Right.
If you control the South China Sea, you are able to dominate Southeast Asia, and you will have a huge leverage on Japan, and South Korea, and Taiwan.
That's a really
so
important point. I'm glad you made that. And I'm just sorry we don't have a map with us today to more clearly depict that first island chain. But I think it's probably fair to say this whole area has been deemed, a vital national interest
Yes.
of China. And essentially, I think, and I wonder if you agree, China really wants control over the Yellow Sea, the Taiwan Strait,
Right.
and the South China East Sea, West Philippine Sea, whichever,
Exactly. Yeah.
whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
And China's being pretty aggressive about this.
Now, today they are aggressive about that.
Mm-hmm.
But they were less aggressive during the 10 years between about 1995 and 2005. So China has always had a vital interest, or if you will, core interest in the South China Sea, in Taiwan, and the Yellow Sea, and so on and so forth. But Chinese behavior changed during the time, with the passage of time, and I think that due to the balance of power, basically between China and the U.S. So China was more assertive, and more aggressive in asserting its sovereignty claims in the South China Sea during the late 1980s and early 1990s. You see the Chinese came down to the Spratly and took over some islands, some reefs in the Spratly in 1988. And there were a clash between the Chinese Navy and Vietnamese, where Vietnam's lost 70 sailors, and an island was taken over by China. And then China took over some islands in the South China Sea in 1992. And then the Mischief Reef in 1995.
Which is an issue between China and the Philippines.
Basically between China and Philippines, but obviously Vietnam also laid claim on those areas.
Right.
But basically it's issue between China and Philippines because the Mischief Reef lies very close to the Philippine coastline.
Right.
So from about 1985 until 1995, China was very aggressive in asserting its rights and its claims in the South China Sea. But then, gradually after 1995, China became more benign, agreed to talk with ASEAN multilaterally. Before, China insisted on bilateralism. But after the Mischief incident, 1995, China agreed to ASEAN multilateral agreement and talk with ASEAN. And then 2002, China signed with ASEAN a declaration of conduct of the parties in the South China Sea. Then China went on a charm offensive in Southeast Asia, built up confidence, and so that created the atmosphere in Southeast Asia that although China has a ridiculous territorial claims, but China would not forcefully assert that. But then, increasingly from about 2005, China was increasingly more and more assertive, and now I think the word aggressive may be apt for describing Chinese action in the South China Sea. So it's an up and down. If you look at Chinese behavior in the South China Sea, and it reflects or it corresponds with the balance of power between China and the U.S.
So the Chinese military gets stronger, and it seems that most Chinese seem to think that America is in decline.
Right.
Their diplomacy, I think you would agree, around the time of the Asian financial crisis, their diplomacy in Southeast Asia was pretty clever, was pretty successful.
Right, but if you look globally, because the Chinese are thinking globally, they are not just a Southeast Asia power, they are a global power. During the late 1980s, you have the decline of the Soviet Union.
Right.
You also had the decline of the U.S.
Right.
We talked about the rise of Japan, the rise of the Asian, tigers, and the decline of the U.S., decline of the USSR during the late 1980s and early 1990s. So that was the time when the Chinese were assertive.
Right.
And then you saw in 1995 there was a presidential election in Taiwan. The Chinese, threatened Taiwan with their missiles in Fujian, and then President Clinton sent 2 aircraft carriers to the area to remind the Chinese that the U.S. is still interested in that area, is still powerful, still strong. And then you have the renewal of U.S.-Japan alliance also during the same time. So that's kind of a renewed U.S. interest in Asia after the end of the Cold War.
Right.
So, and then you have the rise of the U.S. in terms of economic and military, and the U.S. So you have U.S. unipolarity.
Right. Unipolarity. Right.
During the late Clinton and early Bush era. So that was the time when the Chinese think, oh, the world is not moving toward multipolarity, but the world is characterized by one superpower and many great powers, many major powers. So you have one superpower, which is U.S. unipolarity. So how does China, behave in this situation? So China has to reconcile itself with the smaller countries in Southeast Asia. Goes on a charm offensive with them, building trust, building friendship with them.
And there also was a lot of economic benefits too. China was trying to connect itself economically more to Southeast Asia, which actually was quite to Southeast Asia's advantage.
Right.
So, so I mean, China is really using military and economic power both. Huh?
And the reason, rise of assertive behavior in China corresponds with U.S. decline, relative, people talk more about U.S. decline, after the financial crisis. And people also talk about the rise of China. So you have China's rising and U.S. declining. So that is a good opportunity for me to be, more assertive. Because my rise is still here. I just wait for the time. So I think that's basically the way the Chinese behave in the South China Sea.
Well, now, this, of course, we know, as we've mentioned already, and I think it'll be clear to the folks in the audience, that this is largely an issue which we've heard is being contested between China, Vietnam, and the Philippines. But there are other countries involved here, but maybe to a lesser degree. Malaysia, Brunei. Taiwan has claims there, but it's not really asserting itself very much. But what can we say about maybe the Brunei claims, the Malaysian claims? Is there any sort of thing we could say about those?
Yeah, sure. Basically, Malaysia and Brunei base their claim on the EEZ basis.
Okay.
Malaysia, for example, didn't lay claim on the Spratly Islands until the 1970s, when there were discussion about the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea in 1982. So before that, Malaysia already prepared to take over some areas within the EEZ area, so exclusive economic zones of Malaysia, and actually Malaysia designates a couple of reefs in the southern part of the Spratly Islands as Malaysian, on the basis of its 200 miles exclusive economic zone. Yeah, so
okay.
Malaysia and Brunei basically base their claims on the geographical grounds, which is different from Chinese and Vietnamese and also Philippines. Philippines think that they are entitled to occupy to own most of the Spratly Islands because of the proximity, but the Philippines also base their claims on historical grounds. The Philippines acknowledges that the Spratly Islands were occupied by France before World War II and by Japan during World War II. But after World War II, Japan relinquished its sovereignty over the Spratly Islands. But at the same time, Japan did not transfer the sovereignty over the Spratly Islands to anyone else. And so from the Philippine perspective, the islands became ownerless. And so they were available to annexation, which the Philippines did.
Were there, historically, were there any indications of Filipino culture, Philippine civilization on those islands? Were there any communities of Filipinos living there? Or?
No. It was the Spratly Islands was also called the Storm Islands. It was a very dangerous grounds. Another name of the Spratly Islands are dangerous grounds.
Oh, really?
So it's a dangerous grounds, and fishermen rather avoid the area. So although they lie closer to the Philippines coastline, but probably they were first exploited by people from central Vietnam. The Cham,
okay.
Before the Vietnamese came down to today's central Vietnam, actually the South China Sea was called Champa Sea by the Arabs merchant coming from the Indian Ocean coming up to China. They sail through the sea and they call the sea Champa Sea. The same thing with Westerner coming to there, and they call them the South China Sea because they are going to China and they see and think it's south of China, and so.
That's interesting because in Vietnam today you can still see sort of historical structures, and I guess you would call them temples that are Cham temples.
No, I don't think
No?
there were. I don't think that during the earlier before the 16th century there were some temple built on those islands.
I mean in
doubt that.
Vietnam though there's still some of those, right?
Yeah. In mainland Vietnam.
Yeah,
right.
because I remember seeing one just a little bit north of Nha Trang. Yeah,
Yes.
I forget the name of it, but it's kind of a famous one.
Yeah, Mison.
Yeah. I'll have to look at my notes. Yeah, well, so, of course, China says, well, our historic records show there's absolutely no question about this. These are all ours. But as you're suggesting, there are, some basis to these other claims. This is not the claims itself, but there are some basis to them. We know that the Chinese are very meticulous records keepers, and I think
Right.
the Vietnamese are too. So
Not so much as the Chinese.
not as much as the Chinese. Okay. So do you think that the Chinese claims to the islands are strong? They have legs, as they say.
There are two different parts of the Chinese claim. One is on the claims over the territories, so the islands and reefs in the South China Sea, and then the U-shaped line, which is a very recent history.
Right.
So which is I think the U-shaped line, this red dot lines is the product of just a cartograph in the 1930s who would use these dots to these lines to symbolically show Chinese claims in the South Chinese. But now the Chinese government used the U-shaped line in a way that can be thought of as the Chinese claims of the maritime boundary of China in the South China Sea. And so the United States, for example, opposes indirectly that Chinese claim in the South China Sea because the U.S. says that the U.S. opposes any maritime boundary which are not derived from a land feature. So the U-shaped line obviously does not derive from land feature, but there are the Spratly Islands and in the Paracel Islands there, and I think that as I just hinted above, both Chinese government and Vietnamese government thought that the islands were in their control for centuries,
Right.
because they their fishermen regularly visit them. The Vietnamese government think that the Vietnamese kings regularly dispatched sailors to survey and exploit the islands, and they also took possession of the islands. But the Chinese thought, similarly. So I think this is very hard to say whether who came first, and even if you say that the Chinese came first, but the Chinese came during the time when Vietnam was still a part of China.
Right.
And one of the earliest Chinese map which depicts something that the Chinese interprets as the Paracel and Spratly Islands was in the map. The South China Sea was called Jiaoji Sea, and Jiaoji was the name of Vietnam. So it's very complicated and very hard to say.
Now, I just want to make sure I understand something here. Okay, we talked about the red dotted lines here. Now, the blue lines, this is really the
hypothetical EEZ.
Or exclusive economic zone. Okay. And for the benefit of the audience, according to international law, the exclusive economic zones means that the country has control over those waters. It's 200 miles, I think. Okay, so it really does make things very complicated. Very, very complicated.
And that's why I think that a declaration of a code of conduct in the South China Sea would be teethless. Would be of no use, because now, okay, so how do you define where is the disputed zone, and what water is a disputed water and what is not? So for the Chinese, everything within the U-shaped line is disputed. Right. But of course, the Chinese, but for the Vietnamese and the Philippines, they think that everything within their EEZ are not disputed. Disputed are only the Spratly Islands and the Paracel Islands, but not their EEZ waters. So, so the reason skirmishes, the reason clash between the Chinese and Vietnamese vessels occurred within Vietnamese EEZ, and so the Vietnamese said that this is not a disputed area. This is our territory. Right. But for the Chinese, this is disputed area. And so if you have a code of conduct in the South China Sea, so where is the boundary of the code of conduct? That's the problem, right? For the Chinese, they say if the code of conduct says that you have to postpone all of the construction and activities that would complicate the matter, then that will mean that for the Vietnamese they have to stop drilling oil within their EEZ, because most of the here half of the Vietnamese EEZ lies within the Chinese U-shaped line. So and same for the Philippines. Much of the Philippines oil are drilled here in this area. So it's very hard.
This same sort of phenomena is also characteristic in another island issue, which is, the Diaoyutai or Senkaku Shoto issue, which is far north of this. But still, you have the same sort of complicated issues.
Right.
Well, you sort of mentioned it, and that's where I wanted to go there next, is we've, I think, laid some pretty good background here for the folks. The recent flare-up really started when the Chinese vessel cut the wires on a Vietnamese survey vessel.
Yes.
And could you tell us a little bit about that? Because that's really the start of the more recent flare-up.
Yeah, it was in late May. There was a clash between, the Chinese vessel cut the cable of a Vietnamese exploration vessel here in this area.
Right.
So well within the Vietnamese EEZ and off the Vietnamese central coast. And then just about a week later, there was another incident about here. Also, another Chinese vessel, snips the cable of a or entangled in the cable of the Vietnamese exploration vessel in this area. But before the Sino-Vietnamese skirmishes in this area, there were some skirmishes in this area where the Philippines reported seeing Chinese vessels loading down buoys and posts and construction materials in some of the uninhabited reefs in the reed banks, which is about here. And this is an area rich of oil. The Philippines has already done some exploration, some scientific survey of the area, and concluded that this is a very rich area in terms of oil and gas.
I think maybe, going back to our map again, we should perhaps for the benefit of the audience point out that Haiyan Island is an extremely important, very well built up Chinese military facility. There are all kinds of military bases there, Army, Navy, Air Force. The rumor is this is where the new Chinese aircraft carrier is supposed to be based. And also this area has been flooded with, they call it fishing administration vessels, which are really old Navy vessels.
Right, yeah.
And my understanding is, I wonder if you've heard this too, is that China is going to build up the size of its fishing administration.
Yes.
But I think I heard 300 more ships. That's a huge build-up.
Yes, yes.
Is that the number you heard also?
Yes. The Chinese has the plan to double the size and the personnel of the law enforcement
Fishing administration?
administration,
Right.
not just in the South China Sea, but all of the Chinese seas by 2020.
Right.
So, but basically the Chinese have a very different system to protect their rights in their seas. Quite different from the U.S. system. The U.S. system, you have the Coast Guard
Right.
to take care of your EEZ, right?
Right.
But for the Chinese, they have 7 forces, 7 different authorities
Right.
to take care of their sovereignty and rights and resources in within their waters.
Maybe we should mention what those 7 are. The PLA Navy, I guess.
PLO Navy was one. Then they have the Marine Police.
Okay.
And then they have what they call Marine Surveillance, and then Fishery Administration, and Oceanic Survey. So
Okay.
they have 7 forces, different authorities. So only the PLA Navy was under the military, the Ministry of Defense. But the other authorities are under different civilian ministries. So you have the Fishery Ministry, you have the Resources Ministry, you have the Environmental Agency, you have the Oceanic Agency. So quite different.
You just put
forces.
your finger on a huge problem. These 7 forces don't communicate very well with each other.
I don't think so.
and there needs to be, if one, it would seem to me that if you're going to contain this situation, you need to have some kind of centralized control over all of these guys.
Yeah.
Because one could be, say, well, we're going to do this, and the other one say, we're going to do this, and could get out of control.
I think for minor things, they may be, kind of work for themselves without communicating with each other. But for the major skirmishes that we just saw between China and the Philippines and between China and Vietnam, I think China is a centralized government, a very disciplined, and it's just because China thinks and says that the South China Sea is in China's core interest.
Right.
So all these authorities have the rights and the task of protecting and asserting China's rights.
Right.
And China's have a couple of domestic laws to regulate the activities in those waters.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay. You're watching Asian Review. I'm your host, Bill Sharp. Our guest today is Dr. Alexander Vuving from the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies. And we are talking about a very timely topic, and that is the flare-up in the South China Sea, or as we mentioned, the East Sea or West Philippine Sea, whichever side of the argument you might find yourself on. We talked about China, cutting the cables on the Vietnamese survey vessels. And then there was a couple of huge demonstrations in Hanoi. And were those demonstrations just in Hanoi or in other parts of Vietnam?
Mostly in Hanoi, but also in Saigon.
In Saigon?
There were this year, up to now, two Sundays when a few hundreds or even about 1,000 Vietnamese took to the street to protest Chinese activities in the South China Sea, mostly in Hanoi. But there are also people protesting in Ho Chi Minh City from Saigon. But I think the Vietnamese authorities in Saigon were more harsh on the protesters rather than in Hanoi.
Oh,
in
really?
Hanoi, they were more tolerant. They tolerate the protesters more than in Saigon.
Really?
Yeah.
Was there any particular reason for that?
I don't know, but I can, actually I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know
Okay.
why. Maybe it's up to the the local bosses of the Vietnamese government in those two cities.
In Hanoi, maybe we should just mention that these demonstrations were held right in front of the Chinese embassy.
Yes.
That's pretty interesting because I think it's probably fair to say this kind of demonstration couldn't have gone on unless it was endorsed by the Vietnamese government.
Sure, yeah.
And then Vietnam had a rather, well, from what I understand, a fairly large-scale naval exercise, which was live gunfire. And was there any significance to that? How do you read that?
Well, this is probably the Vietnamese have had annually or regularly, live fire drills with their navy in the past, but they just not announced it. But now the particular, the very interesting thing with this time is because they announced it right at the time when tensions are here in the South China Sea, and so I think that they want to send a message to the Chinese and also to the domestic audience in Vietnam that they are ready to fight. They are ready to confront with the situation. That they are not afraid of China. I think those kind of drills they should have had already in the past a couple of times because they have a navy and they have to exercise.
Right.
Yeah.
What strikes me is, interesting about Vietnam. Vietnam's history, of course, is colored by clashes with China. And it seems that so many streets in Vietnam are named after some Vietnamese hero who was victorious against the Chinese. So that history is in people's face every day.
Right.
A very proud history of repelling the Chinese. Well, and then Vietnam asked for American assistance. And where's that going to go? How far is that Vietnamese requests for American assistance going to go? What can we expect?
Officially, the Vietnamese did not just request the U.S. assistance, but they said that they welcome international involvement and welcome international assistance in resolving the South China Sea issue, because the Vietnamese argue that there are some parts of the issue of the dispute in the South China Sea which requires international solution because they affect the international community. For example, the EEZ issue. It's not just a bilateral issue between China and Vietnam, because it also affects the freedom of navigation.
Right.
It affects the boundary of the international waters. And then the Spratly Islands. Obviously, it's a dispute between so many parties. So from the Vietnamese perspective, the South China Sea issue is not just a bilateral issue between one country and another country, but it's a multilateral issue between the claimants and also other stakeholders from outside who has an interest in freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, and who has interest in the stability and security of the region. And so, from the Vietnamese perspective, it requires a international solution rather than bilateral solution. But obviously, the Chinese do not want international community to be involved in that, because they want to exploit, they want to take advantage of the asymmetry of power between China and the smaller claimants in the South China Sea issue. And so, from the Chinese perspective, I want to exclude so many people from this issue, so I can deal one-on-one with each of these small countries. So I am a big country, and if I can deal bilaterally with a Philippine who has almost no navy, or I deal with a communist Vietnam who doesn't have any security treaty with any great powers outside. So that is my advantage. So from the Chinese perspective, the Chinese insist on bilateralism.
That's very interesting, because what you say there, because well, we know that the United States has a long-standing mutual security treaty with the Philippines. Is there any possibility that the United States and Vietnam might create a mutual security treaty? Or is it premature to ask that?
No, I think it's not premature. It's possible, although it's very unlikely. Very unlikely, but possible, because between the U.S. and Singapore there is no treaty. But now the U.S. is coming back and building up a facility in Changi Naval Base, and would dock some U.S. vessels there to protect the sea lanes of communication in the area. So Singapore is kind of an informal ally without a treaty with the U.S. Now you can imagine in a couple of years, already right now, the Vietnamese and in the U.S. Said that they are working toward a strategic partnership, and you can imagine they can define, their strategic partnership is something, something similar to what the U.S. has already have with Singapore. And then the U.S. can, send their vessels to dock in Cam Ranh Bay.
Exactly what I would ask. And I've heard there's a possibility of some kind of American base, or maybe Americans having control of part of a Vietnamese naval base in Da Nang.
It really depends on how the Chinese behave. If the Chinese push too hard, then, for the smaller countries in Southeast Asia, they have to think of the unthinkable. And we have these sort of, like, as you're suggesting, these little sort of secretive bases, kind of like, and I've heard repeatedly, well, theoretically, the United States doesn't have any bases in the Philippines. Subic Bay, Clark, they're going. But in Mindanao, we have what amounts to a base. It's just not called a base. Same with the Chinese. They have, big vessels armed with guns, but they don't call it military.
Yeah.
It's non-military, it's civilian. So
Fisheries
administration. So people working like that.
Right. It all sort of dilutes the impact of calling it a naval vessel or a military base. Yeah, and it seems like, as you mentioned, the Philippines doesn't have much of a navy, or not to sound offensive, but not much of a military either. But it did send its best naval vessel out to sort of let the Chinese know we're here. and the Filipinos seem to be pretty annoyed with the situation. And usually it seems Filipinos sort of roll with the situation, but this time they seem, as far as I can see, kind of upset. This whole South China Sea thing, to what degree is it motivated by nationalism versus to what degree is it motivated by natural resources?
Oh, I think this is a very difficult question to answer because they are intertwined with each other.
Mm-hmm.
Whenever we see, you look at the angry that the Chinese, the Vietnamese, the Filipinos exhibit, and you look at it's a combination of nationalist sentiments, the care for sovereignty, but also for the care for natural resources. And if you look at the media, how they depict the natural resources in those areas, so I think that for all of them, economic motives are very important. But at the same time, nationalism is also very important motives. The Chinese say that South China Sea has an oil reserve that may surpass that of Kuwait. That the South China Sea is the second Persian Gulf. That every year, if the Chinese are not assertive and not protecting their rights, then the Vietnamese and the Philippines are stealing Chinese oil and Chinese natural resources to the level of $12 billion or even $40 billion during the last 2 or 3 decades. So from the Chinese perspective, economic motives is a very important. But also from the Vietnamese and Philippines, it's very hard to discern how much it's economic and how much it's nationalism. It's very, very difficult.
The Vietnamese oil resources, offshore oil resources, have been sort of a consistent topic of conversation for a long, long time. It was so many people in the United States that said, well, the United States' motivation for being involved in the Vietnam War was to secure rights to the Vietnamese oil assets. I really don't personally believe that, but I mean, that was the view of a reasonable number of people. And they're so vital to Vietnam. I understand, Vietnam's buying 6 Kilo class submarines from Russia, and those are all being financed through oil revenues. And Sukhoi 30s, I guess, are being financed in the same way. So it's really rather vital to Vietnam. Speaking of buying Kilo class submarines, are we going to see an arms buildup in the South China Sea? It's going on now, really?
It's going on now.
Yeah,
definitely.
We don't have to wait for it. It's happening right now.
Yeah, the Chinese has built a submarine base in Hainan. They upgraded their facilities in the Paracel and Spratly Islands. So did the Vietnamese. The Vietnamese also acquired new weapons for their navy and their air force. Upgraded their islands in the Spratly Islands, and now the Philippines also joined the race, announcing they are going to invest $1 billion into the modernization of their navy.
Oh, I hadn't heard that.
And even before the Vietnamese and the Philippines, Malaysia had already invested a lot in modernization of their forces.
Did they buy some Russian submarines as well, Malaysia?
Malaysia had deployed 2 submarines in the Spratly Islands. One from that they acquired it from Spain and France.
Spain and France.
Yeah, and already there for the Vietnamese, they are just waiting for the submarines coming from Russia, but they haven't. They don't have it right now.
Do you see any cooperative effort between, say, like Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei? Any cooperative effort to secure their claims, or their claims are actually competing against each other?
Right, but there are some sporadic cooperation efforts by Vietnam and Malaysia and the Philippines. For example, in the past, Vietnam and the Philippines proposed the kind of joint exploration, even before the Chinese initiative in 2003.
Right.
During the 1990s, 1996, Vietnam and the Philippines were already tried to explore jointly the areas, but then it was not. It didn't go anywhere because of the Chinese. And then between Vietnam and Malaysia, they got a joint submission of the extended continental shelf. They submitted that jointly to the UN in 2009, which triggered Chinese protest and Philippine protest. So there are a couple of bilateral cooperation between Vietnam and Malaysia, between Philippines and Vietnam, between Philippines and Brunei, but not kind of more multilateral among the smaller countries. I think one of the factors is because they don't want to give the Chinese the impression that they are, ganging up against China. That is the problem. They don't want to, because that would anger the Chinese, and so they would do it bilateral with each other. And again, that is detrimental to the interest of the other parties.
You mentioned joint exploration, and of course, my understanding is this has been one Chinese idea of how to tame the situation down. We'll just sort of in a very friendly fashion, develop these resources together. But that doesn't seem to have much traction. From what I perceive, tell me if I'm wrong, other countries are really not interested in that joint exploration.
Well, there were an incident, a precedent in the past of joint exploration, which between the Chinese and the Philippines and Vietnam, which was Chinese initiative to co-opt the Philippines to the joint exploration. The Vietnamese protest that before, when the Chinese and the Philippines jointly announced a joint exploration, but then the Vietnamese had to join what they just protested a year before, because they see that if they do not join them, then they were put sideline, and then they would be the losing side.
Oh, so is that joint exploration still going on?
That was not, no. So that was the Chinese initiative with the Philippines, with Philippines cooperation, and then the Vietnamese saw no other alternative as to join. But then it was the Philippines who saw in that they were the loser, and so they stopped doing it, and so it was dead.
Yeah, I've seen that too with the north of Taiwan. There's an island called Chunxiao, which has been a bone of contention between China and Japan, and there was this idea to jointly explore that, but that is not really going anywhere. The one thing I've heard is kind of interesting lately is that Indonesia really doesn't have any claims in the South China Sea. And of course, Indonesia is a big country, and it's a very important one. And there's some speculation that Indonesia could be a broker in the South China Sea issue. Do you see that going anywhere?
Actually, Indonesia is not totally neutral to the South China Sea dispute because although Indonesia doesn't have a claim on the Spratly Islands, but Indonesia has a portion of its waters overlapped by the Chinese claim.
Oh, I see.
So Indonesia is also involved in the debate with China. And actually, 2010, the Indonesian, after the clash between Chinese vessels and Indonesian vessels in the Indonesian EEZ, the Indonesians launched a protest against the Chinese U-shaped line with the UN. So Indonesia was also part of the larger dispute between China and the other countries in Southeast Asia over the maritime boundary. Not over the Spratly Islands, but over the maritime boundaries, the U-shaped line.
I didn't realize that.
And so that's one thing that Indonesia is not totally neutral to the dispute. It's also part of the larger dispute.
Okay.
And then
We're getting down to our last minute and a half here. Okay. And I think just here at the end, we should probably say something about the U.S. role. The U.S. has offered its services. China, as I understand it, has said U.S. butt out. And I don't know where it's going to go from there. It doesn't seem like we're really on any kind of road to resolution here.
I don't think the U.S. can play the honest broker role in facilitating cooperation between China and the other Southeast Asian countries. I don't think so because obviously from the Chinese perspective, the U.S. is, if the U.S. throw their weight into the debate, then that means that the balance of power between China and the Southeast Asian countries are redressed. To the extent of China, to the extent of China, and so the last thing that the Chinese want is to involve the U.S. in the dispute.
As you suggested before, China really wants to deal with these much smaller countries one-to-one because they think they are bigger, more powerful, and can get what they want. Thank you very much for joining us. It was great to have you.
Thank you too.
You're welcome.